Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and I'm joined today by Kurt Williams. Now, Kurt Williams runs Cruiser Outfitters. He is a legend in the Land Cruiser community, not only for his knowledge, but also his experience traveling in Land Cruisers around the world. Kurt and I have traveled on numerous continents together, big trips with Expedition 7 and other journeys like crossing Greenland using Hilux. But Kurt is a real wealth of knowledge around Land Cruisers. He has owned several 100 Series Land Cruisers, and he's really learned about how best to modify them for overland travel. We also spend some time talking around which models are best to consider, things to look for when you're buying a Land Cruiser 100 Series or the LX equivalent from Lexus. We talk about kind of good, better, best around modifying the vehicles for long-distance overland travel. So please enjoy my conversation with Kurt Williams. I want to take a moment for a special announcement of our newest video series on the Expedition Portal YouTube channel that features exploring the Smoky Mountains and the East Coast. This multi-part series is presented by Hancock Tires and is hosted by renowned explorer and photographer Sinway Xavier. This series will start at the end of September and run through all of October, featuring a Trail Scout episode, a Jeep Gladiator feature vehicle, trip planning and preparation, and some installments showing the local artisans and places to visit around the Smoky Mountains. We appreciate Hancock's ongoing support of the Overland community and this podcast. Well, Kurt, thanks so much for spending the time here at this incredible Land Cruiser Heritage Museum in Salt Lake. I mean, what a facility this is.
Pretty amazing. It's our dear friend Greg has had this vision, and this building is just amazing. And this is the third location. I think now you've been to all three.
Yeah.
And it just kind of keeps getting more and more amazing each time.
And this is my first time at this particular one. And I heard this morning that you guys just went over 100 units here in the museum, including the new 250 is here under roof. And it shows how a vehicle like a Land Cruiser, where it's not only an exceptional vehicle, but it also creates this sense of community like so few others do. And that was formative for Greg.
Absolutely.
Certainly when he was young.
Yeah, I think, and even moving into why the museum's here, I think Greg has always said that, there needs to be this community, this focal point, like to inspire the community. And so we have our annual event each year, Cruiser Fest, that we get hundreds and hundreds of Land Cruiser owners come. But just every day through the front door, Land Cruiser owners make their way here to come see this place. It's turning into quite a destination from around the world.
And when you read the comments on Google of this place, people are blown away.
It's a little shocking when you walk through that front door and come in here. Now the building is so amazing, but from the outside it's industrial. It's a 100-year-old building. Yeah. Then you come inside and see all these vibrant colors. It wakes you right up.
Yeah, and you kind of come through that smaller entryway, and then it just opens up into just a sea of Land Cruisers.
I shared with you this morning that the first time I visited the building, long before it was the museum, Greg said, what do you think? This place is going to be amazing. And I'm like, I'm just not seeing it, Greg. It had the rail tracks underneath us. There was ore cars running through, and there was a foundry. There were tractors and big piles of molten steel. And I'm going okay, all the windows were busted out, and he had the vision, and obviously had the vision, the resources, and the kind of the bandwidth to make it happen, and here we are.
And you can see it, absolutely. Yeah. Well, today we are going to talk about the 200 Series Land Cruiser, which I think is it's a neat one to talk about for a couple reasons. It's probably the vehicle in my 25 years or so of doing this that I changed my mind on the most. When the 200 first came out, I probably felt like a lot of other Land Cruiser owners did, where we had gone from what we felt was the pinnacle with the 80 series with the front and rear lockers and the center diff lock and the solid axles. And then the 100 series felt like a departure from that. And then the 200 series felt like an even further departure from that, where even the design language looked more reminiscent of a Highlander than it did of a classic Land Cruiser. So I think in the beginning, for me, it was just this concern that the that Land Cruiser was going to take this direction that was further and further away from heritage. But then I started to get the opportunity to drive the vehicles. But I would say that the thing that changed my mind the most and was also an important lesson for me in not making early judgments around things was when Greg and I went to go pick up the 70 series Land Cruisers in Japan. We had the opportunity to meet with the lead Toyota Land Cruiser engineer, and his name escapes me, but
Koyari-san, Yoshi
Koyari-san,
yeah.
Yeah, and he, incredible gentleman that loves Land Cruisers. And he asked me the question, he's like, why did you choose to not take a 200 series? Because it's available here in the U.S. Why are you going all the way to New Zealand and
Australia, New Zealand, South Africa?
To try to get this car.
Right.
And it was interesting because I said, well, the 70 series, it's solid axle. It's so durable. They're so strong. And he's like, yeah, I can see the solid axle and the payload and everything. He says, but actually the 200 series is the strongest Land Cruiser we've ever made. And that completely, that made me ask more questions. And I asked him, I said, why is that? And he said, well, it's a heavier vehicle to begin with overall, and it's designed for carrying not only passengers, but towing, and it has a much larger engine, so much more torque in the diesel and more power, et cetera, in the gasoline engine. So he said we had to make it very durable. And then he showed me this video of them taking it through this rock quarry, basically. And the 200 series was skidding across boulders at speed, like full just suspension cycle, just bang, 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 all the way through. And he said,
proper flogging.
He said the front end on that is stronger than any solid axle we've ever made. So that, to me, it was a really important lesson to not make snap judgments on things, but also to really understand that a company like Toyota, when they make a Land Cruiser, it still means exactly the same thing to them that it did in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's a general consensus I've always heard through speaking with both Koyari-san and other chief engineers, or many different ones, shouldn't say just both, had that conversation with quite a few, is that the only goal with the Land Cruiser, I mean many goals, but the primary goal is it has to be better than the previous model. Has to exceed that in as many factors as possible. It could be certainly on-road performance is important to Toyota, but off-road and rough-road performance. Now, could easily make the argument, like many, that the 80 series was like kind of the pinnacle of the off-road, rough-road performance with the solid axles, front and rear, the coil suspension, which was new for the 80 series. But the fast forward, and just as we found with the 100 series, the 200 series chassis is every bit as stalwart. And it's from a longevity standpoint, like we're going to see them reach half a million miles here in the U.S. without a problem, with just normal maintenance over time. So we're starting to see those higher and higher mileage ones, which kind of proves the point.
I think so. And one of the things that people need to know when they think about a J-Series Land Cruiser like this is that they are designed to run for 500,000 miles. They're designed to operate in austere conditions, which would be developing world conditions for 500,000 miles. Not without failure, but like the chassis, the drivetrain, everything is designed to provide a service life in those conditions for 500,000 miles. And there's just not another vehicle that I'm aware of that has such a focus on surviving those conditions for that length of time. And it's the reason why Toyota is now the vehicle of choice, either in conditions like Australia, where people are very remote and the roads are very abusive, not necessarily technical, but abusive. They drive Land Cruisers. And if you go to Africa, every NGO, I mean, they used to drive patrols as well, but you can't get them anymore. So it's just the Land Cruiser now.
They kind of own those markets. They've really found a home, and a lot of those are with those chassis that we don't necessarily see in the U.S., but the 200 series is very prevalent in those countries as well, particularly Australia. You see a lot of them there.
And you can see in Africa, you'll see unique series of 200s where they'll have barn doors in the back, they'll have factory winches, steel wheels. So they're
a lot of
really
different configurations.
They're really unique.
Yeah.
But in the U.S. in particular, We received the 200 series with a V8, a naturally aspirated V8. It started off, I believe, with a 5-speed transmission, and then went to a
6-speed to 8-speed.
6-speed to an 8-speed. Got
In
it.
2015, as of 2016 models, when you saw that jump, but motor-wise stayed the same. It was the same V8, the 3URFE, all the way through the 5.7. Very common motor in the United States market because that was also shared with the Tundra and the Sequoia. So we saw that in quite a few platforms stateside.
Yeah, and then the vehicle was also sold by Lexus as an LX570, if I remember correctly. So you can get it in a couple different variants. Interestingly, as I understand it, the Land Cruiser actually sold in the fewest numbers. The Lexus actually sold in slightly higher numbers. So you might actually be able to find a Lexus more easily than a Land Cruiser.
Yeah, certainly true on the used market to this day. Like there's just a lot more volume of them. And I'd say one benefit of the Lexus trim versus the Land Cruiser one is availability. So that drives the price on the used market. The other one is the Lexus ones, for many different factors, were often used less off-road by their previous owners. So they're very clean. They've had a lot more perhaps overall maintenance done at the dealer level versus Land Cruisers may, in second, third owners, maybe they were starting to do some of their own maintenance. Not that that's a bad thing at all. However, you can get really good service records with an LX 570. So you can often still right now find one that's been serviced at the dealer its entire life. You've got all the records of it and still in like the 100,000 mile range because some of these owners, it's just maybe a second vehicle and they're not driving it a whole lot. So there are some really good buys on LX 570s.
And if I recall, the LX 570 also had some differences in the suspension. What were those?
That was the real key. Whereas the Land Cruiser had, in the U.S. market, there are some different ones around different markets, but in the U.S. was just a traditional coil and shock combination, and in the front, a coil over shock combo. So easy to replace, both with stock components or aftermarket from any manufacturers, any relevant manufacturers, all have something for the 200 series platform. However, on the LX 570, it had what was called AHC, auto height control suspension. Because of that, it used a far different system, actually hydraulic shocks that were controlling and taking some of the payload as well. So not only could it change ride height at the selection of a button, but that was also some of the payload and the spring rate control. So you can't just remove those shocks because the coils they otherwise had were a little lower spring rate.
I see.
The problem with that, you couldn't always just pull that right off and put normal stuff on. But fast forward, the aftermarket and kind of the community has found ways, like a certain combination of which fuses need to be pulled, which stuff has to stay, which has to come off. So now at this point in time, any of the 570s can be modified. You can put a traditional aftermarket suspension on them. And I wouldn't say that you need to, though. Go drive one if you're looking in that market, because the auto height control system, when it's functioning, and it is very robust, it works really well. Like the ride quality is actually better in a stock form. Plus you have the different ride heights. So at speed, you can get a little better fuel economy. I'm not saying you'd notice it, but it's there, loading people in and out. But then in an off-road mode, it had like a high and even an extra high that was to the tune of like 4 or 5 inches in delta in that suspension height.
And then does it auto level as well, so it has height position sensors?
It can, yeah. It can and will. It has height position sensors at all 4 corners, so it kind of knows what everything's doing. It could change the rake even on the highway at speed for better handling. And so there's a lot of cool things it did. The caveat of it overall in the lifetime of it is that if it starts failing, it can be expensive to repair. That said, many users are still putting new components on those even at 300 and 400,000 miles to keep that system working. I'd say the big one is if you really start loading the vehicles up like we like to do often with payload, be sensitive to that when possible. But when you start exceeding kind of what that system was designed for, you're still under the GVW of the vehicle, but you just can't get the same handling at those higher weights when you start putting things like bull bars, winches, skid plates, a lot of extra weight that's always on the vehicle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have, in your mind, is there a sweet spot? Is there the model to get? Is it the Heritage of the last year, or what do you think is the one that currently is the sweet spot?
I don't think there's a bad year of 200 series or 570. This 8-speed transmission on the newer one certainly is a smoother shifting, kind of runs really tidy down
Does
the
it have
highway.
a lower first gear?
It does. But it has a significantly lower first gear, but also has significantly numerically lower, so higher differentials. So it went from 390s in the diff down to 330s with that 8-speed. But the 8-speed still has definitely more pickup and punch in first gear and can handle bigger tires easy. So anything 16 and newer, I do love the 8-speed, but I've got a 2008, which is a first year of the 200 series here in the US. It's an early build too. Came out in 07 as a 2008. It's not had any problems. So like usually, a lot of people say from any manufacturer, stay away from the first year. Yeah. Hasn't been, the thing's been great.
Yeah, probably caveat emptor on the Land Cruiser. It's probably just fine.
It's just fine, yeah. Exactly. So like we could put a little asterisk next to that suggestion.
Yeah.
There are things that got added along the way. So it's just about the creature comfort you want.
Yeah.
Cooled seats or ventilated seats in the later years. Of course, that 8-speed we talked about, a little upgraded dash, certainly a newer change on the dash. So my general consensus with all Land Cruisers, when you're looking at a certain series, is the latest one you can afford is probably the best one. With the lowest miles. Yeah. Yet the later the year with the lowest miles, that's the best one.
But that's good because like when you look at like 100 series, for example, there were years where it had that 2-pinion front end. There were things that were not as advantageous, easy enough to fix. But, just there are years of other Land Cruisers that are better than others.
You're right. Yeah, we saw that with the 80 series. There were some big changes. There definitely saw that with the 100 series with front pinion, differentials, some different things that changed. But on the 200, there wasn't a whole lot that changed from 2008 all the way to 2021. Now, the Heritage Editions were a neat offering, only available in 2020, 2021. Those last 2 years, you could get it as a 2-row model.
Yes.
And one benefit to me of a 2-row model is I take the third rows out of everything I own and do drawer systems or other sleeping platforms. So one less thing to put on a shelf and feel bad about taking out. But the bigger one to me is then it just didn't have the seatbelt stuff. Like the trim was different. So even after you modify and add those drawer systems, it didn't look like there was missing stuff. You didn't have seatbelts still back there. That's a total nuance, a minor one. But that was cool in those later years. I
like the fact that, since it was certified as a 3-row vehicle and the payload was set for what would be, essentially 6 or 7 passengers, then the payload was actually quite high on the 200. And when they did the 2-row model, they kept the payload high. So you actually ended up with the biggest payload of any 200 because of that, because it didn't have the seats.
Yeah. And there were a couple other little minor changes on the Heritage that, not that are going to be a huge change in the payload, but a little bit. They got rid of the center console cooler, and you could have just a normal center console. You could or could not. There was a little bit of change on those in those later years. Also, they got rid of the door striping down the sides, like the molding, so it was just a clear door, which I kind of like this clear look. A little different seats and interior. Came with a roof rack that not everyone loved. You could take them off easily, but
easily take it off.
Yeah, exactly. Comes off easily. But they were they're good ones to have. Now, because it is a Heritage Edition, it has that badge on that back D pillar. They do demand a premium even to this day. They're doing just fine in the market. So some of those early ones are where the deals are.
Well, and the nice thing about that, yes, it's more expensive when you buy it, but if you ever were to resell it, you've got the most desirable 200. So that's another. You're kind of hedging on a future return, but overall, in my experience with the 200 driving it, there's a couple things that I really like. It tolerates roof loads better than any of the other Land Cruisers.
Okay, see that.
So if you do want to run a roof tent, like if a roof tent is something that is of interest to you, 200 series is going to take that roof load really well. In fact, the 200 series had, depending on the market, but when I did the research, it had up to a 240-pound roof load rating, which is quite a bit better than most other vehicles.
Most advertised roof loads.
Most SUVs have a roof load rating of 140 to 150 pounds. So the 200 has 100 pounds more on the roof load rating. So that's one of the things that I think is really relevant around the 200. The other thing that I really like about it is it's a global model. So even with the V8, it was sold in many markets as a gasoline V8. But it was certainly sold in nearly every developing country as a diesel. So even though you're unlikely to have a reliability issue with a 200, when you're driving it around the world and you pull it into a Toyota dealership, they're going to be able to change out the bushings in the lower control arms. They're going to be able to swap out a CV. They're going to be able to service the vehicle fairly easily because it was in market.
Yeah, that is a neat part of Land Cruisers in general, but certainly the 200. And because it had so few changes throughout that time, parts compatibility is amazing on what like tie rod ends and inner and outer tie rod ends, CVs, for example, full range of the vehicle, regardless of what motor package it had. Could have the V6 gas, could have the V8 gas, could have the V8 twin turbo diesel. All of them use the same CVs, same axle shafts, a lot of components. Now, 6-speed to 8-speed changed a few things, but overall, like a lot of parts compatibility. So that's massive. And I would agree, it's like suspension-wise, it's one of the most refined we've seen out of any Land Cruiser to date. It went from the 100 series and the 470 was a torsion bar, which works well, but not amazingly. It doesn't offer a lot of travel. There's limitations there. The 200 series went to a true coilover in the front and some of the most robust lower control arms we've ever seen on a Toyota product.
Any product.
Any product. They are a massive lower control arm, a big, massive lower ball joint. So you just don't see, that's not something we experience failures with.
Even with big tires.
Even racing them with big tires. Like we've got one that we race that's running 37-inch tires and gets beat pretty hard. We don't see bushing and ball joint failures or inner and outer tie rod failures.
Yeah,
we
that's
get
an
play
interesting
over time, but not like no failures are very uncommon on those.
That's an interesting point in this discussion is that, you know, a mutual friend, Joe Bacall, raced these Lexus Land Cruisers for many years, was very successful in the Baja series. And then you guys purchased that vehicle and you're Kangaroo Racing, is that right?
Kangaroo Racing, yeah.
All right. So
Spanish for kangaroo.
I like that. So now you guys have been racing this same vehicle now for 5 or 6 years?
Oh, a little longer than that. It's going on about 10 years now.
Okay, right.
So yeah, Joe was racing it as a Lexus sponsored. It was a Lexus build. The vehicle we're running was built by Geyser Brothers, a famous chassis builder and desert car builder. Joe ran it for Lexus, had a very competitive and did really well, had some great wins in it, including some championships in the Baja 1000. We bought it from him when he was done racing. We'd always told him, like, hey, if you ever want to sell that, we'd love, it's a very neat build, and we all love Toyotas. We were racing a different vehicle at the time, and he called up, actually reached out to me one time and said, hey, you guys still interested? And this is about 10 years ago now, and we jumped on it. Fast forward, we've raced it about 8 or 9 different Baja 1000s and a lot of smaller races, Vegas to Reno, Mint 400. And what that did is it cemented the 200 series to so many members of our team that now there's probably 10 of us with 200s as support vehicles because of how stalwart we found that vehicle. I mean, it's amazing.
And what did you, in racing conditions, where did you find the weaker links to occur?
Well, so we run, it's called stock full in desert racing. So we're required a stock motor, stock transmission, stock axles, and stock suspension. Now we can have a lot of shock. We've got keen coilovers and bypass shocks front and rear, and a lot more travel. So they'll let you change the mounting locations of the shock. But the other components are all OE Toyota. And we knock on wood, we don't really find like any massive weak links. Like that car, it's unreal that it's raced that many races. We do a full rebuild on it.
Oh, of course.
In racing prep, we put new upper and lower control arms on it, front and rear every race. We put a new steering rack because after 1,000 miles of desert racing, they all get some play. They get some wear.
The bushings,
they do. And I actually equate that. I've found like great. This is great R&D for my business selling Land Cruiser parts because we found something that wears out in 1,000-mile desert race or starts to get a little bit of play in it is going to be something a customer with a Land Cruiser that has 250 or 300,000 miles is going to need on their daily driver. So it's about a 200 to 300x of the wear factor, if you will, like that's happening in a race. But none of it, we haven't found anything that's like a crazy weak link. Overall, like given what that thing pushes, that's on the factory motor. We've done nothing to the motor. We do oil changes. I mean, that thing's got probably 30,000 race miles on it, just getting beat to death in the dust.
That's insane.
If anything, like weak links are going to be the aftermarket components or the safety components that are required to race.
Sure.
We've had issues with aftermarket fuel pumps. We've had issues with our air filter system that we run a big giant air filter for the dust, and it's just not always enough to keep dust out. But overall, that thing's been amazing. Now, it's in a stock class, so we're not the fastest ones out there on the race course, but that thing has an amazing finish rate, like in the 90% finish rate, which is for desert racing is pretty impressive. And that really solidified the 200 series. That's why I own one.
Yeah.
You know, after racing that, I said, like, these are easy.
It's like,
everything I thought I knew, and I had a 100 series at the time, and it's like everything I thought was better about the 100, the 200 really is better.
Yeah. So let's talk through the process that someone would make in modifying a 200 series for overlanding. In your mind, what would be the top 3 or 4 things that you have found consistently improves the overall experience of traveling in a 200?
Suspension, and not that you need to change it for height, but just getting something that handles a little bit of the weight that you're likely going to be adding, both in terms of gear you may have permanently bolted on the vehicle or accessories, but also just like the day-to-day payload that comes in and out of the back as you start adding jugs of water, lots of food, or maybe passengers. And there's a lot of great suspension components out there. Of course, Australia's been doing suspensions for them, the Australian companies, since they were brand new. And the benefit of that does let you get a little bit taller to put a plus size tire.
Yeah.
The factory equipped tires on the Land Cruiser they were never an awesome setup. In my opinion, they had this amazing off-road vehicle, and part of what gave it that, maybe discredited it to some in the industry was they looked at like the tire package that came on it from the factory. Never bothers me that bad because that's the first thing most people do anyway is choose a different tire combo. The wheels were even very strong.
Does it fit a 17?
It does, yeah. You can run a 17 on it, no problem. I run 17s on my 200 series. You have to be, a little caveat there is not every 17-inch wheel will fit, just depending on like kind of the shape and the profile of the actual forging or machining of the wheel, but most 17s fit. And and then a plus size tire, so getting them into like a true measured 33, 34-inch OD tire fits really well on a 200 series.
The wheel wells are fortunately a little bit bigger.
Pretty big. Yeah, they added some more room there. Suspension handles all that just fine. Drivetrain handles all that just fine. Like, don't really have to start getting into gearing and brakes, any upgrades there until you get into the kind of like 35-inch range, and then maybe need to start adjusting those items just to keep it stock performance.
It does seem like 35s are becoming more popular, but I don't know that I would, for travel, I don't know that that's actually an advantage. I mean, in my mind, something like a 295/70 17, so like a 33/11/50, or like a 255/80 R17, so that would be like a 33 by 10.5. Those are going to be the tires that are actually going to be an advantage for long distance travel, because you just don't, once you get a really big tire, they're hard to find. They're hard to replace. And when you're in the middle of Africa, you're just not going to find it.
Not going to see that. And I totally agree. I run the 295/70 17 on mine.
Yeah.
Could I squeeze a bigger one in there? Sure. Would it look awesome? Absolutely. Yeah. However, for daily driving and I get a lot of road miles on that, up and down. That's been up into Canada, and I take it down to Mexico every year to support the Baja 1000. That just seems to be a good moderate tire size that doesn't ever leave me feeling wanting off road.
Yeah.
But then I don't also, on the other hand, feel like I'm pushing to need to re-gear and deal with like upgrading brakes to push a bigger tire. And even with 35s, I mean, while the wheel well will accommodate that to a fair degree at full travel, full stuff, 35s start requiring a fair bit of trimming if you're really pushing it off-road. That's different than something that you're just building as a rip around town vehicle. But if you're really using it off-road, 35s will rub.
And special thanks to Overland Explorer Vehicles, also known as OEV, for their generous support of this week's podcast. The OEV is one of the most respected camper builders in our industry, using premium 4-season construction and the highest quality components to manufacture campers capable of traveling around the world. Even the Overland Journal podcast host Ashley Giordano uses one of their tray model pop-up units on their Tundra for traveling throughout Europe and Northern Africa.
So that's a big one. I'd say a little bit of beefed up suspension, for payload more than anything, a little bit of more positive handling, because the suspension package on the US models particularly, they were really looking at kind of ride quality, vibration. It was a softer feel, a little bit of dive, a
lot of dive
there, to be fair. Yeah. Now they do have KDSS, so they handled body roll really well, but the suspension just stands to help that even a bit more.
And do you find that up to a certain degree, you can still retain the KDSS? So if you go with maybe plus 30 to 50 millimeters,
you're able to retain the
100%.
KDSS.
In fact, all the way, even customers running 35s, 37s, the KDSS, you can get KDSS extension links, but even in the stock form, it doesn't require a whole lot of modification. So yeah, mine still, I run KDSS on mine, and most customers do. Works really well.
And have you found, what have you found on spring rate for most people that are setting up a 200 series for travel? So you're going to see, maybe 500-600 pounds of static load increase in the rear. Are you finding that like a plus 150 per side or a plus 300 per side? What do you
100 to 150 is like the common upgrade on a pound per inch coil on the back. Dobinson, Old Man Emu both have like a wide array, including, this is interesting, that's commonly done, is a lowering spring for the back, like either a 0-inch height, like a stock height spring, or a -1 in the back, and then go +1 or 2 in the front. Because if you look at a factory 200, they did have quite a bit of rake.
Yeah.
Now, I don't always advise getting rid of rake, because rake allows you to have some transient load you put in and out of the back without getting squatty.
Right.
But also there's some handling characteristics built into having a little bit of rake when it comes to your caster on the front end is designed to have a bit of that in there. So I like to have a little rake just so that when I'm fully loaded, that doesn't go away. But for those that want a very aesthetic level stance, there are even lowering springs for the back while bringing the front end up in all of those different weights too. So in a stock load weight, a medium load, which is going to be up like a plus 50 to 100 pounds, or up to like 100 kilos, so like a 200 pound. And then even way beyond that, because 200s can be built as armored vehicles. So there are some massive coils available for these.
And that's what's interesting. If you look at a 200 series, how much they've been pushed to the limits. I mean, Arctic Trucks in Norway built military 200 series Land Cruisers on 40s. And they were very heavily loaded and armored. So you had an armored 200 on a 40-inch tire.
It's a lot of weight.
And they just don't have chassis and driveline failures. When we drove the Hilux across Greenland, or when I drove the Hilux across Antarctica, we would use a 200 series transfer case because they actually hold up to all of that. Well, day after day after day, low range, high heat, they were getting failures of the Hilux transfer cases. And so the 200 series rear axle is also fitted.
It is on this one,
Also fitted to the Arctic Trucks. So there's a reason why there's so much of that built-in reserve. The reason why we do not want to overload much beyond gross vehicle weight is in a country like Australia, they will have random checkpoints. We saw one when we were in Australia.
I remember that.
They were off of the side of the road, and they were pulling guys with campers and everything else like that onto
checking
this
your
thing.
overall weight, and they had scales.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if you are over what is your listed gross vehicle weight for the vehicle, you can either get a ticket or be taken off the road until it's remedied. Flagged for that. And then in the United States, let's say you were 1,500 pounds over your gross vehicle weight, and you were to get into a really bad accident, and the insurance company's looking at this huge liability, and they take a look at your vehicle and they see that you've added, willfully as the owner, you've added, 1,000 or 1,500 pounds over the gross vehicle weight of the vehicle, and now you've gotten in an accident. They could say, well, you modified the car outside of its safety limits, which include braking, handling, and all these other things. So even though a 200 series, shockingly, will do it all day long, there's some real liability and regulatory considerations about not overloading vehicles. And also, the thing's gonna perform better. It's gonna be more enjoyable to drive. You're gonna get better fuel economy, all of those things if you just kind of keep it a little closer to the gross vehicle weight.
Totally agree. Right, wrong, or indifferent in the U.S., we don't have, liability aside, that's a very real thing.
Yeah.
And I think we will see that happen more and more in the future as insurance companies look at heavily modified vehicles and say, that's not our, you did this, right?
Right.
But we don't have the same GVW kind of regulatory that Australia and other countries have. Well, one benefit of that in countries like Australia, for example, is that you can do GVW upgrades, right? GVWR, GVW upgrades, and actually improve brakes, improve suspension. So a lot think that you improve the payload by just changing the suspension. And while you can increase the payload by a change in suspension. You don't like really approve.
You can maintain the ride height.
The ride height stays the same, but brakes don't.
Yeah, that's right.
Your suspension doesn't solve brakes. Doesn't solve a lot bigger rotating mass of tires.
Cooling system of the engine, all of that.
Yeah, right down to just even chassis stiffness, right? I mean, that chassis was designed to hold a certain weight. So you're right, the 200 does kind of cover for you in a lot of regards. Not saying that that's recommended. And to use one of my favorite Scottisms ever is your vehicle build is only done when you've taken the last item back off of the vehicle. Yeah. There seems to be like this curve of build your vehicle, add everything, bolt everything on, and then you're really only done when you take that stuff back off. But which is a great advice, and I use that saying all the time. But really, maybe think about that before you bolt all the stuff on in the first place. Keep it simple.
Yeah, and these 200 series. I mean, you and I could take a Heritage Edition tomorrow and drive it around the world. I would not even everything we did with E7, other than Antarctica, we could have done in a stock 200 series. Yeah. Maybe change the tires because the tires.
They need a better tire.
The tires are pretty rough, but like stock tires, stock size.
Yeah. And we saw them everywhere around the world, right? I mean, like they were there. You'd see a 200 about everywhere. I will add one additional modification that I would do if you asked 3, and I'm going to throw my third is they do very much, particularly the 3UR, which is the 5.7 gas. Very much benefits from a little extended fuel range. So an added auxiliary tank in the rear, which there's great options available, 12, 24, 40-gallon tanks. That starts to be a lot of weight. So consider that. What does 40 gallons look like hanging off the back of your vehicle? But even
because petrol would be 6.33 pounds per gallon.
So call it at a 40-gallon tank. I mean, including the tank itself, all the peripheral, plan on about 500 pounds, all hanging behind the rear axle where the factory tire was. It's a lot of weight.
Do they have an increased size main tank?
I don't know. That one, I haven't seen an increased main tank because there's just not a lot of geography there. Now, Long Range Automotive out of Australia or Brown Davis, they may. I'd have to look into that. But I'm a big fan, and like some of these, in fact, this vehicle right here it's a 12.5-gallon tank in the back.
Yeah.
And it actually fits above the spare tire. So you can still keep your factory spare in its location. That way you're not getting into you don't have to get into a rear bumper and all that added weight, and there's some clearance issues there. But 12.5-gallon gives you like an additional half of a tank capacity. That's just enough to usually push you about anywhere. And I've traveled all over Utah and all over the West and down into Mexico, and I'm never the first one worried about fuel with that extra 12.5 gallons. So
and if I remember, the factory has a 12.5 or has an optional tank like that.
Yeah, a non-US, you could get a factory sub-tank. So if you wanted to keep it really pure, that's possible to do, is use a factory sub-tank in the rear, get all the, you could dial it in the front with factory sub-tank buttons. But it was never offered in the United States with the secondary tank. But yeah, it's a smaller sub-tank in the back.
Yeah, and I think even the 100s and the 80s had that all above the spare tire.
Yep, well, all of them are in that same location back there.
Yeah, when I look at the 200 series builds, in my mind, they're a heavy vehicle, so that means they can struggle in soft conditions. So paying attention towards self-recovery with the 200 series, I think, is a good idea. When you're in a super lightweight Jeep with tons of reserve capability, you don't tend to get stuck that much. Whereas when you're in a heavy Land Cruiser, which has reserve durability, it has reserve capacity, not so much reserve capability. So I think on a 200 series, you're going to be better off thinking about, should I install a rear locking differential? Should I install a self-recovery winch? Or should I at least make sure that I have, 2 or 4 recovery tracks, something like a Max Trax along with you? I think it's a really good idea to pay attention towards self-recovery with Land Cruisers in general. I've been surprised where Land Cruisers have gotten stuck.
They're heavy.
They're just heavy.
You're absolutely right. Compression surfaces, sand, snow, they're a big, heavy vehicle.
Yep.
And you put something that's 7,000 pounds when fully loaded with all your gear and people on board in sand and other compression surfaces with a traditionally narrower tire than maybe a lot would run like on a Jeep. And you can start digging some holes pretty quick. And they are heavy things get stuck, and heavy things are hard to get unstuck on the flip side. So plan accordingly.
Yeah, and they're just a larger vehicle, so you end up with a lot of chassis stiction. They're just they're more difficult to recover, and I think a lot of times because Land Cruisers have so much durability, people kind of don't pay attention to what they've added. The number of times I've asked someone with a 200 series how much it weighs, and they'll say, "Oh, maybe 6,500 pounds," and I'm like,
No way.
like it was close to 6 when it was new.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I know, mine's the same way. I mean, it's heavier. I do have a lot of stuff, but I've scaled back on a lot of the things that I put on there. Gone away from a personal opinion, gone away from a rooftop tent.
Yep.
I have a rack on there with AluBox mounts, but I leave them all empty. I only use that if I absolutely need that storage space up on top. Sleeping platform on the inside, kind of just try and keep it simple and minimize. And a lot of that was weight in mind, because they handle really well. That 5.7 pushes. It's the most powerful Land Cruiser motor we've ever seen in the U.S. market. Yep. However, under load, they still struggle, and that's the economy really dumps off as well.
Did you supercharge yours?
Mine is not supercharged. Yeah, a lot of customers have them. Dave's got a supercharged one. Yeah, we help Dave with that.
As Connors does.
And we've done a handful for customers. I actually owned one for a minute that was a supercharged one. They're fun, but this one's older. And then I actually have a Heritage kicking around too that I've done nothing with. It has just still in the very few miles on it. It doesn't get driven.
Still got it wrapped in plastic.
It is. It truly isn't all its original plastic. It has. I'll break the secret. It has 40 miles on it.
So my gosh!
I drive it 1 mile every other week, and then I let it. I have a very a really good regimen of how it gets warmed up and how I drive around the block once a week. And the plan isn't to keep it as a time capsule. It's my next one I build. I got to sell this one to kind of fund building the next one. But at the tail end, I did pick one up just to have, so I could build one. I may supercharge that one. We'll see.
Well, overall, the 200 series is a vehicle that I commonly recommend to people. When we did our top 10 used overland vehicle list many years ago, and I've updated it several times since, the 200 series has remained in that number one position because it is something that guys like you and I can recommend to anybody, any new person to overlanding, and they say, what should I go get used? I've got $28,000 to spend. I'm going to be like, buy the newest, lowest mileage 200 series that you can find because when it's stock, it'll take you around the world. If you modify it lightly, it will take you around the world and even into more remote and challenging locations. So they're just an exceptional vehicle overall. And there's no red flags with it. There's just not that thing of like, oh, you got to do the doohickey mod because it's a problem.
Yep, no major weak links. I just say, vet it out. If you're shopping for one, climb underneath there, spend some time. Better yet, get it up on a lift. Chassis corrosion is kind of a big one. Not because they were inherently prone to that, but we're just looking at a 20-year-old vehicle this time. So
and they could have been owned in New York City or whatever. Yeah,
very salty climates, or here in Salt Lake, if they've driven it up and down the canyon a lot, not properly cleaned that chassis, we can get some bad rust. That's when they get hard to modify or hard to service. It's just if they've been maybe misused or abused, or they haven't kept up on preventive maintenance. But yeah, to your point, there's not like any of those major, you have to do this on every one of them. Like things were pretty well vetted out, and that's why they didn't change much from 2008 all the way to 2021. There were not a lot of changes.
I do believe it's really important if you can get one with a clear service history, especially those one-owner cars. Those are going to be worth spending a little bit more money or waiting, being patient to find. Because the one thing about Land Cruisers is some guy will buy it, and he's buying it for his wife and kids to drive, and they haven't done an oil change in 20,000 miles.
Happens.
But it happens with Land Cruisers a lot.
It does, yeah.
Because they're
forgiving of that.
Yeah, and people just forget the fact that you have to put oil in every once in a while. So you got to make sure, if you can find one with a good service history.
I also wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of you for listening to the Overland Journal Podcast. By listening to this podcast and subscribing to the Overland Journal magazine, you're supporting our employee-owned and veteran-owned business. Impartial reviews and in-depth content like this would not be possible without your support. If you enjoy the podcast, I think you'd really love the print magazine as well. And 100% of that subscription price goes back into creating the content like you're listening to right now. And as a special thank you for your loyalty, we're giving 20% off any subscription. And that even includes our special lifetime subscription, which includes numerous lifetime-only benefits. You can go to overlandjournal.com and use the code OverlandPodcast at checkout. Again, that's code Overland Podcast at checkout, and that'll give you 20% off. I sincerely appreciate your support.
That's gonna be a cream puff right there.
Yeah, and don't neglect to look at the LX 570 if that's an option. They are great options as well. Plenty of built ones on the market. A lot of accessories available from those. For a while, some of the accessories were harder to fit, things like bumpers, sliders, because of that AHC. But now companies like Slee and Descent and others, CBI, they're starting to do accessories that work on the LX 570 just the same. Or you can, with a little bit of ingenuity, you can swap some of those Land Cruiser specific 200 series ones to the LX. So because of you mentioned they did, it was like 2-to-1 overall, kind of real meatball math there, that about twice as many LX 570s as they sold 200s in the US market. So because of that, there's just a lot more 570s available as an option. And don't discount those because there's a lot of great things about them.
As I recall, in 2016, they also added the tighter turning radius button where it locks that inside
Turn assist,
where it locks the inside rear tire to help tighten a radius of a turn. And I believe they also improved the traction control at the same time.
For sure.
So if you don't plan on putting a locker in the vehicle, you may want to consider the newer one because it will have a much better performing hill descent control, traction control, and normally traction control is all you need for a travel vehicle. But if you do want to put a locker, you can put them in front and rear. I think a rear is all you need in the 200 series, and it really does change the vehicle. A rear locking differential just allows the whole vehicle to slow down through challenging terrain. You're not having to use quite as much momentum or wheel spin to engage the traction control. And then traction control is still going to be available in the front differential, but it will be even more effective because you're now not trying to arrest two spinning
tires.
Yeah.
That's 100% true. They all had crawl control, even starting in 2008, and they had the A-Track. So all those systems are there on all model Land Cruisers, but as they got newer, that system got more and more refined. And on the 16 Plus with the 8-speed, it's significantly more refined, operating the crawl control and the traction control systems. Turn assist, there's definitely some use cases for it out there. Not one that's like a deal breaker for me personally to have. However, there are use cases where it makes sense to have.
Switchbacks.
Switchbacks, I've used it. I've seen it in use. I've seen times where, hey, he didn't have to back up or do any crazy jockeying because that thing pivoted right around. So that is neat on those newer ones as well. But the crawl control, traction control systems definitely got a lot more autonomous and smoother in those later years. Therefore, you had to use less momentum and less speed into obstacles to get those systems working.
Any other thoughts on the 200?
No, overall, great machines. No caveats. Do get one. I think everyone should own one. I wish there were enough available for
There's
everybody.
not. That's the biggest challenge. They're like hen's teeth. I've had so many great memories in 200s. We talked when I first got to the museum here about Rob Boheim.
Yeah.
HEMA Maps that has their 200 series Land Cruiser is diesel. It's a twin turbo diesel, and it's in the Land Cruiser Heritage Museum. I've driven across Australia in it. You've driven it.
You and I got to go take it for a little trip in Australia.
We did take it in a trip in Australia. And then it was brought to the U.S. Chris Cortez, when he was on our team, drove it. Rob drove it here in the U.S. It went all the way up into Alaska and Canada.
The HEMA Map Patrol in the U.S. here.
That's
using that vehicle as kind of their base camp.
Yeah, so the 200 series, again, it's the one vehicle I've changed my mind on the most, and I highly recommend it. So.
No caveat. Yeah, I totally agree with you there. It'll be fun to see. We're just not too far off, a few more years, and some of these diesel import 200s are going to be U.S. legal. We're not too far off of 25 years to get a VDJ 200 with that twin turbo V8. That'll be interesting to see how many of those come over to the U.S. I'm sure a few will. There'll be some collectors.
I bet Greg will put a plate on this one.
You never know.
Kurt, thank you so much for the time talking about the 200 series Land Cruiser. We thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.